welcome back to Book and Page. We are still working our way through Beowulf, and we're sort of at the in-between time, which is to say, we've killed 2 monsters, we're working our way up to a 3rd, but it's going to take us a bit to get there. So, as always, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in this section, and then talk about things in a little more detail. So, the battle with Grendel's mother happened last video. Beowulf has now returned to Hrothgar victorious with Grendel's head and the hilt of a sword. And we start this section with Beowulf recounting his fight with Grendel's mother and the location of the sword that allowed him to slay her. He then presents the hilt of said sword to Hrothgar. And we get a bit of a description of it. There are 2 main things we find on the hilt. There seem to be some images of the defeat of the giants during the Great Flood, which is to say that in the Bible, God saw this really wicked world and decided, you know what? You're all done. So he collected one family, that is the family of Noah. We at least get Noah, though there is a belief that, of course, he has family members, and we know he does have sons after this point, so his wife is at least here, if not the sons already. And Noah builds an ark. He puts 2 of every animal on the ark, and they survive the Great Flood as everything else is wiped out and wiped clean. And this is actually such an aggressive act that we have God swearing after this not to ever do something like this again. And so we seem to have the giants wiped out during this. I mean, apparently not, because Grendel and his mother have survived, and they seem to be the line of Cain, so something's gone weird here. But hey, that seems to be normal. And along with these images, there's also ruins on the sword hilt of the name of the person that the sword was forged for. So, very cool. Hrothgar takes it and he's just like, excellent! And then he starts counseling Beowulf. And this counseling continues periodically throughout this section, so there's always going to be points where it comes back. But we have this counseling about how to be a good leader and a good king. And at one point Hrothgar does say, like, if your uncle, through unfortunate circumstances, dies without an heir, I trust that your people will recognize that you will be a fantastic king. I'm not getting any Macbeth vibes from this at all. No. But mostly the counseling's about how to be a good leader. And this can apply whether or not you're a king or just a leader of a fighting band like Beowulf is. So the counseling we mostly get is that a good leader sets his own pride aside and lets wisdom and reason rule him. If he gets too much focused on his own wants and his own greed and his own pride, then he's going to be a bad king. And of course, all of this counseling is paired with descriptions of bad kings. So they don't give rings. They send their people off to die for no good reason. They kill their own people, things like that. So, Hrothgar tells Beowulf, set pride aside, be a good king, let wisdom rule you, and you will do fantastic. And it's like, cool, excellent, let's have a feast, let's go to bed, and they wake up for the first time in 12 years to a night that hasn't resulted in slaughter. And this is kind of this weirdly understated moment that I'm excited to talk about after this. So they wake up, and it's like, yay! And Beowulf's like, cool, death is done, we would like to go home now. Like, me and my companions, feeling the call of the sea, call of home, we're gonna go. And Hrothgar's like, right you are, here is even more treasure, and again we get some counseling. Be a good leader. And they swear allegiance to each other. Basically the idea that I will come and support you, you come and support me, and we'll be stronger together. And after this sort of oath of allegiance to each other, They embrace, and Hrothgar weeps, because somewhere deep inside of him he knows they are never going to meet again. Because we're actually told that Hrothgar is quite an old king. We could have envisioned him as being younger, because he's only been in this hall for 12 years. But we're actually told that he's ruled the Danes for 100 half years, which is to say 50 years. That's a long time, keeping in mind that he was probably at least in his mid-20s by the time he took over, simply because his father had to pass away, and then his elder brothers did as well. So we're looking at a very old man who is having this recognition that Beowulf is a young man who will go on ultimately to do great things. And we actually have even the narrator recognizing this as old age stealing Hrothgar's strength. And how sad that actually is. And you're just kind of like, ah, Hrothgar! Good to see you, man! And Beowulf and his companions load up their ship with all their treasure. Beowulf gives the Sea Watcher, who first spotted them and has been watching his ship, a golden sword. And Beowulf and his companions sail off home to Geat. When they arrive, well, they've got all this treasure, and we instead get an offshoot rambling moment about the Queen that isn't super clear even in the translations. Yeah, it's a little weird, but if you haven't noticed, this book can't always stay focused on things. It kind of likes to just meander off and talk about something over here for a while. Which means this is actually quite a short book for just the main action bits. And like I said, we are now in that in-between state of working our way up to the next and final big monster. So it will take a bit to get there, because we are only on video 7 out of 11. So we're taking some time to build up. But this is sort of the first segue piece in which it is the leaving of Denmark back to Geatland. And it's kind of heartbreaking because of all the foreshadowing that's been set up, both for Hrothgar's Hall and also in a lot of ways for Beowulf. In a lot of previous sections we've been told that there's a bigger story here, and ultimately Heorot is going to fall into civil war and self-destruction. And then we're told here that Hrothgar is very old. So we actually get the sense almost immediately now that that ultimate civil war is fast approaching. That the starting point is going to be the loss of Hrothgar. And that speaks to how strong of a leader he was, that he was actually keeping this dissonant hall together in a positive way. Because when we're told these moments about the Civil War coming, we're told there's not yet any of this disagreement, there's not yet any of this anger and resentment among the people of the hall. Which is to say that Hrothgar is so good of a king that not only does everyone fear him and not want to go against him, but they respect him and love him to the point where they don't want to go against him. And it's sad then that we know ultimately that it comes to nothing. That somehow the court wasn't raised by Hrothgar and his family members, because we've been told from speculation, because again we don't have the full story, but through speculation that likely his nephew takes the throne rather than either of his sons. So these men haven't been raised with the respect of kingship that is allowing peace in the court right now, despite Grendel. And maybe ultimately because of Grendel. It might actually be that we're seeing almost the worst part of the cycle here. Now, we've spoken before about this cycle of peace and violence. And we're going to see this really clearly towards the end of Beowulf's life and towards the end of this particular tale. But we can see it coming for Heorot as well. Which is to say that ultimately there's sort of two sides of this cycle. There is the side of war and the side of peace. And most stories are going to show you war and then moving into peace. And you're going to get the big heroes who are achieving that. But something you always have to keep in mind is those heroes then become obsolete. Because a hero at war, once peace is made, can't exist the way he has previously. You can't have a blood-soaked hero who just wants to go out and fight everybody in a peaceful city. Because then you're just going to destroy yourself again. So what we see, unfortunately, is either the death of the hero, and this is a well-known cliche, you either die the hero or see yourself live long enough to become the villain. Or you somehow have to reincorporate that person back into the hall peacefully. And we've seen this again a little bit with Beowulf. As they're heading back to Heorot, we get this telling of great hero stories and about them becoming good kings. And this is an attempt to bring Beowulf back into society so that we're not going to have just this battle rage come into the hall. Because that's what Grendel basically was. So we have to bring Beowulf back down. And this can be really, really hard. And there are tons of stories about this going wrong. For example, Odysseus gets home, and what's one of the very first things he does? He kills a whole lot of people in his own house. Whether or not that was justified is a discussion for the Odyssey. But you can see the concern about violence back in civil society. The problem is, what we're seeing foretold here is the other side of the cycle. And this is why I say it's perhaps the worst side of the cycle. Because this is when peace times devolve into war. And again, ultimately, it's the heroes of peacetime who become obsolete in the creation of war. And the heroes of peacetime probably sounds really weird here, but it's those people like Hrothgar who are such powerful, respected figures that have done everything they can for their people, but their people haven't necessarily learned from. These are the figures that bring peace and prosperity, but the peace and prosperity ends up then spoiling the next generation, who have only known peace and prosperity and just want more and more. They want a bigger piece of the pie. They're not seeing perhaps what Hrothgar has seen, which is to say destitution and everyone needing to work together and share what they have and protect each other from beings like Grendel or other communities. And so community has to work together to have this peace and prosperity. But then certain generations, having not experienced hardship, forget about that, and it becomes all about me. I want more for me and my own, without realizing that the whole community has to be your own, because it's the only way you're going to survive. And that's exactly what we're seeing foreshadowed here, is the next generation taking for themselves, and the entire society devolving into war, because they've never understood this concept of taking care of each other, because that's the only way you're going to survive. And like I said, it's the worst part of the cycle, because the cycle of violence, causing violence, is terrible, but you can see perhaps an end to it. peace devolving into violence, especially a civil war type, or war within one family, is very hard to see and very hard to deal with. And that's why it's sort of heartbreaking that we have Hrothgar counseling Beowulf in a lot of important ways, and then embracing him knowing that they're never going to meet again. And that's because Hrothgar's old, and despite all the counseling Hrothgar gives Beowulf, Beowulf is still proud. He's actually described as proud several times within the sections around this. Beowulf isn't the perfect leader. Hrothgar is trying to encourage him in that direction. But Beowulf still has his flaws. In fact, most people do. That's why Hrothgar's counsel here is so important. It's actually more of asking Beowulf to recognize a weakness in himself and to try and safeguard against that becoming such an extreme problem that everybody else will suffer for it. What's really heartbreaking then is Hrothgar's weakness seems to be his inability to recognize these problems within his own household. He can recognize it in Beowulf, but you're always going to recognize the problems of some external group before you necessarily recognize problems within your own group. It's part of the us versus them mentality, and it's part of how humans tend to survive. You always have to have trust in your community. And it will take a lot for that trust to be broken. But I think sometimes we take it too far, which is this blind trust in our own community and just heat rays against every other community. Because the worst problems grow from that. The Civil War problems grow from that. The inability to recognize there is something wrong with our own foundations that we need to fix, or we are going to fall. So Hrothgar counsels Beowulf and never seems to counsel his own people. And so that's something we have to take to heart and keep in mind as we're moving forward here. How much are we ourselves blind to what's happening around us? And how hyper-aware are we of the faults of the further group? The people we're not a part of. And can we start evening those out? Can we recognize the positives of that further group and the faults of our own? Because Hrothgar certainly has actually balanced out the positives of Beowulf as well. We get a really, really proud king of a man who's not even, like, of his own community. Like, Hrothgar is #1 Beowulf fan, to the point of saying that he would be an excellent king. And you're just kind of like, don't put that in somebody's head. Now, Hrothgar does say, like, if something terrible happens and your uncle dies, then you could be king. But a lot of us must be thinking to ourselves, this is the witches telling Macbeth he's going to be king, and Macbeth deciding that how he's going to be king is kill the actual king. There is this concern about Hrothgar saying, don't be proud, but also, you're absolutely fantastic. I think you should be king next if something happens to your uncle. Are you trying to cause problems here? And that's the weird thing about Hrothgar, because you kind of want to feel for him, but knowing what will happen to his household after he's gone says there was something fundamentally wrong with his kingship that the loss of him will kill the entire community. And then him turning around and saying to Beowulf, hey, if the throne's ever empty, you could fill it. You suddenly start realizing exactly maybe the lessons he has been teaching to his nephew and his sons. Which is, fight for what's yours. And fight for what you think should be yours. Make yourself the best man for the job, and then make yourself that job. There are problems here. Very concerning problems that suddenly make us wonder what's going to happen when Beowulf returns to his own community. Are we going to see the safe return? Are we going to see the reintegration of Beowulf into a peaceful community? Or are we going to see Rage Monster come in and either destroy himself or destroy the peace that's been happening? I think we're just going to have to wait for that. I think we're going to have to read further and try and figure out exactly what's happening. Because there's a build-up to the dragon. And that build-up might seem unfair, especially since Grendel's mother came immediately after Grendel. But I think that build-up and the fact that we're then going to be facing a dragon is important for us to dissect. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.